Welcome inside the War Room. I'm your host, Andrew Valancourt, and we're back today for episode 81 of the Dynasty War Room podcast. On today's show, we're going to talk about some players to trade for. So last week we touched on players to trade away if you were a rebuilding team. Today we're going to focus on the contenders and talk about some guys that you should be looking to trade for to help you go win a championship. And so I've got some players at each position, a couple more names actually than last week. And so we'll get into that. A mix of some veterans and some young guys. And before we do that, though, as always, make sure you are following this podcast on your platform of choice. We're on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, you name it. We're there. So go make sure you follow along so you don't miss any future shows. And find us on social media as well. So we're on Twitter or X at Dynasty War Room. You can find our YouTube channel at the same handle, Facebook page, and you can find me on Twitter or X, Blue Sky, any of those channels as well at Andrew V. Court. So go check that out as well. And one more reminder to go download Fast Draft. It's a new best ball app. It's awesome. They got a lot of great contests and different sorts of events going on right now. So I would highly recommend you go check that out. Use my code WARROOM when you deposit and then download anything up to $50. You get a full deposit match once you play through a contest. So go check that out. Again, Fast Draft. It's a best ball fantasy app. It's awesome. Highly recommend again that you check it out and use the code WARROOM when you sign up. All right, so let's get into some players. As per usual, we will start with the quarterback position. And, I just want to first say that this is not just for contenders. There's some players on here as well, especially the younger ones that can fit for really any team. But this will be catered a little bit more towards the contenders. There's all sorts of, young, talented players that you can go after if you're a rebuilding team. And my general recommendation that I think a lot of people overlook or forget about for a rebuilding team is to go out and trade for injured players. So Malik Neighbors, Egbuka, some of those young either star players or budding stars or guys that have a lot of potential that were off to good starts, that sort of thing. Even if you are a team that you thought you might compete and then everybody got hurt. You might have some of those players already on your team, but you can go out and get a Joe Burrow or somebody along those lines, So it doesn't have to be just trading for draft picks or healthy young players. You can go after injured players as well. Keeps your total points for low since that's how a lot of leagues do their draft order. And it, still allows you to get some young pieces for your rebuild. But let's move on into the quarterbacks, talk about some veteran players that contenders can add to their teams. And let's start with Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. He's 32 years old. He's off to a hot start. The Cowboys as a team, not so hot, certainly struggling so far into the season, but I think that's for the most part almost exclusively because of their absolutely terrible defense, which I think a lot of people expected to be the case. And we love bad defense for fantasy football because that means a lot of offense. And Dallas has been lighting up the scoreboard. Dak Prescott's been great for fantasy. George Pickens has been great. CeeDee Lamb, before he got injured, was doing well. Javonte Williams has been awesome. Jake Ferguson. Up and down the board. That's a lot of very, very good, productive fantasy assets on one team. We're not just talking a couple solid starters. We're talking top 5, top 10 players at their positions across the board. So Dak Prescott is going to throw the ball a ton. He's going to keep doing it. He's going to get CeeDee Lamb back. Could be as early as this weekend. If not this week, within the next few weeks, he should return from that ankle injury. So Dak Prescott is somebody that I think at 32 years old is not going to be somebody that costs multiple first-round picks and that sort of thing like a younger player would, or like Dak might have cost himself, 3 or 4 years ago. At 32, I certainly think he's still worth at least one first-round pick, and, you'll probably have to tack on a little bit to that. But again, it all depends on your league and the situation. But, if you want to add a player that you're going to be able to plug into your lineup, you're going to have to give up something of note, particularly for these types of players. It's going to be picks. And so Dak Prescott is somebody that I think can give you elite quarterback production without the, 2, 3, 4 first-round picks that it would otherwise cost to get, a young top 10 quarterback. Because, you look at those types of guys, the Josh Allens, Lamar Jacksons, the Drake May has been off to a really hot start. His price has skyrocketed. Patrick Mahomes, Herbert, there's all these guys. And Prescott can give you pretty similar production on a week-to-week basis, but he's not going to cost you what those other players would cost you. The same can be said about Baker Mayfield. He's the next quarterback on my list, Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback, 30 years old, and he's off to another really good start to the season after his huge breakout year last year for fantasy, and he makes this list despite his wide receivers, injury after injury between Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Emeka Egbuka, and he's still performing. And eventually he should get all three of those receivers back over the next however many weeks. We don't know exactly how long the Egbuka injury is going to be for, which is disappointing because he's been off to such a great start as a rookie. But Baker can still get it done. And if you're a contending team, I think it's very similar to Dak. You're going to have to give up at least a first, but what else on top of that is going to depend on your league and the situations. But Baker Mayfield has a really good playoff schedule. Weeks 15 through 17, he gets Atlanta, Carolina, and Miami. So 3 pretty solid defenses to throw the ball against, especially Carolina and Miami. And so Baker Mayfield, with his weapons, who again will be back at some point, I think that's just a very high-powered offense. Even Bucky Irving is hurt right now, so that's a lot of injuries on that Tampa Bay offense. And Baker is holding it together, and I think when those guys come back, he's going to continue to be an upper echelon QB1. All right, so let's talk about a few running backs. And running back is a little bit difficult because, of course, rebuilding teams are going to be looking to unload the older running backs. So before I talk about the 3 names I have here, if there is a rebuilding team in your league or a team that is maybe thought they were contending, but things are going poorly and they're not looking like a playoff team at the moment, players like Derrick Henry, players like Christian McCaffrey, some of those older but still good running backs. CMC in particular, he's the number 1 overall running back. He's been incredible in PPR leagues, and the team that has him actually is probably doing pretty well. But on the off chance they're not, he's somebody that you obviously should be going after if he's available. Derrick Henry could be somebody that maybe you're buying low as an older player that hasn't been that productive this year, but things will get better when Lamar returns. You could probably get him for cheap. There's a handful of those 29, 30, 31-year-old running backs that you can take a look at. Some others on the older side, a Tony Pollard is getting a little bit older. Tajay Spears will be back soon. So there's a number of guys. But the 3 names that stuck out to me as the non-really obvious guys to go look for, number 1 is Breece Hall. 24 years old, so he's still a younger guy. He's on the last year of his rookie contract with the Jets, and it does not appear that he's going to be re-signed by New York, at least not at this point in time. And with the Jets really struggling, Breece Hall certainly becomes a trade candidate, not just for fantasy football, but for real life. Breece Hall could be traded to a running back needy team. There are a number of them out there that are still alive, fighting for playoffs. I think Arizona is a team that could certainly use a running back given the injuries to James Conner and Trey Benson. There's a number of teams I think that would benefit from having somebody like Breece Hall in their lineup. And so regardless of whether he gets moved to another team with a better offense or he stays in New York, I think he's still somebody that is a valuable running back to have. His price tag has certainly gone down from where it was a couple years ago. This is not a guy that's going to cost you a boatload, but I think you're probably looking at the late first, early second, something in that ballpark. I think a late first in general is probably pretty on point. I think that with the name value, you're probably going to have a tough time acquiring somebody like him for less than that. But nevertheless, it's certainly worth poking around. Maybe you can get a deal done for multiple seconds, something along those lines. But either way, I think a first, before the season, I think I did see a number of trades across leagues where Breece Hall was going for like the 105, 106, something like that in rookie drafts. And I think his value, it certainly hasn't improved. I think it's at least about the same, if not a little bit lower, given the situation. So I think that's a good, point to start at if you're serious about trying to get something done. And even if he stays with the Jets, he had a bad week last week, but Braylon Allen is injured, and they're not going to be playing the Denver defense every single week. So Breece Hall is going to resume catching passes. He's still going to be the workhorse bell cow guy as long as Braylon Allen is out, despite the Isaiah Davis factor, who should be picked up on all rosters. So go check your waiver wire in case there is a trade. Isaiah Davis should be rostered in Dynasty leagues. But Breece Hall is young enough. He's still very talented. He's got the pass catching ability that we look for in fantasy. And so I think as a contender to have as an RB2, RB3, I think he's a nice player to add to your team and would be worth the cost. The next guy is Josh Jacobs from the Green Bay Packers. Now, Jacobs is going to be more than likely more difficult to acquire than a Breece Hall because he's been so good with the Packers. I mean, back-to-back huge weeks. He's only 27 still, and he gets Chicago and Baltimore in weeks 16 and 17 of the fantasy playoffs. So the schedule lines up. He's the clear bell cow. He's doing everything for Green Bay. And I was a little bit skeptical, I think, in the offseason of Jacobs. I think everyone liked what we saw last year from him, but, the contract situation, at this point, it's really more of kind of a year-to-year thing with him because of the lack of guaranteed money that remains on the deal. But he's been so good that there's no way that Green Bay is going to move on. At this point, he's locked in. He's been great. And if he's on one of those teams that, middle of the pack or worse, I think you can go out. He's going to cost you a first-round pick, but he's a player that would certainly help push your team over the top to be a contender. And given the age, he is at the point where a lot of rebuilding teams would probably be looking to get out because he's young enough that you can get a first-round pick, but he's old enough that, after this year and looking into next year, it's like you just don't know how many more years you're going to get. Once running backs hit 28, things usually really take, a big hit. And really at 26 is where I think the initial decline usually begins. So far he's avoided that. In year 27, he's been pretty good. But just something to be aware of. But I think that's what would make him a little bit more easy to acquire than if he were 25 years old. So Josh Jacobs, the number 2 running back on this list. Next up is Saquon Barkley, Philadelphia Eagles running back, 28 years old. So he is starting to push that age, closer to the cliff. Certainly he's at least at the cliff now. And he's almost at that Christian McCaffrey, Derrick Henry type of situation, but not quite yet. And he's been off to what I think can be described as an okay start to the year. At least by Saquon Barkley's standards. He's still, a low-end RB1 for fantasy football, which is still very great. We can certainly love and appreciate that for our lineups, but after his amazing dominant season last year, it's fair to expect the Saquon Barkley manager to be a little bit disappointed in the performance that they've been getting. So, if they were banking on those huge numbers again, their team might be struggling. This could be an opportunity for a contender to come in and pick up a Saquon Barkley for, a late first-round pick. I don't think it's going to be a situation where you're looking at an early first or anything like that. I think mid to late is really what you're looking at. In fact, the price tag on all 3 of these guys is probably not all that different. It's just something where it depends on what your team is looking for. Hall, younger, but the production hasn't quite been there. Barkley, older, but has the really substantial production history. And then Jacobs, similar in age and probably currently in the midst of, a hot streak, if you're looking for just right now immediate high-level production. So just depends on kind of what you're looking at. But all three of those guys, I think, will be good additions for a contending team. If you want a bonus name that's a bit cheaper to acquire than these guys, if you're not looking to give up a first-round pick, you're looking at a second or maybe a player of similar value with some later picks or something like that. Jordan Mason from the Minnesota Vikings could be someone of note. He's going to have to share the backfield again with Aaron Jones eventually once he returns from injury, but Mason has looked very solid in his time as the starter, and I do imagine that he's going to remain kind of the 1A in that committee. So he's not going to cost you a first-round pick. You're probably talking a mid-second for him, maybe a late second, something along those lines. And he, I think, can still give you a nice boost as a flex play or a rotational running back start, just depending on your situation, because he's somebody that, especially if the matchup is good on the week-to-week basis, I think it's fair to expect, a top 15 performance out of him. So he's, a tier down from the other guys, but somebody worth checking out if you're a contender. So let's shift gears to the wide receivers, where I have 4 names for you. So I've got 2 older guys, 2 younger guys, and we'll split it up. We'll go with a veteran first. So we'll go with Denver Broncos wide receiver Courtland Sutton, 30 years old, coming off a poor game against the Jets. I'm sort of just choosing to throw that game out for the most part because it was such a terrible game by both offenses over there in Europe. I just don't think that we should expect that poor play to continue for either team. Both teams have pretty good defenses, the Broncos in particular, and I just think it's something you can overlook in terms of Courtland Sutton. I think he is the clear number 1 target for Bo Nix. It's a good Broncos team. They're going to be in every game. It's a team that can move the ball. I trust Sean Payton's offenses to put the ball in the end zone. And he did sign a contract extension before the year, so if you're worried about the age, I think you might be able to squeeze an extra couple seasons out of him, despite the fact that he's 30 years old. So it doesn't just have to be a 1-year rental type of trade. I think you can expect to at least get 1 more full season out of Sutton, potentially 2, maybe if you're really lucky, even 3. I mean, we're starting to see players play a little bit later into their 30s, so we'll see what you can get there in terms of the length of, productive, fantasy play from Courtland Sutton. But at least for this year, I think he'll bounce back from last week. He's going to be a very good fantasy receiver, a top 24 guy on a week-to-week basis. And I think he is worth moving. I don't think you're going to have to pay a first to get him. I think a second-round pick would probably get it done, especially depending on your league situation or if you have any players you can toss in or later draft picks. But I don't think he's a first-round type of player in terms of a price tag. And I think he can still be a very good wide receiver 3 for a dynasty team that's a contender. And I think that's a really valuable piece to have. Next up is a young player that is could go for both rebuilding teams and contenders, and that's Rome Odunze from the Chicago Bears. 23 years old. I think he is fully taken over the number 1 spot on that team from DJ Moore. Again, another guy that had a bit of a rough, most recent game, but he is Caleb Williams' number 1 target. I mean, this is somebody that they were drafted in the same class, first-round pick, somebody that we had really high expectations for coming out as a rookie and kind of got buried on the depth chart last year. But he's broken out, and I've loved what I've seen from him. And as long as Caleb Williams can, continue to improve and show some more consistency every single week, that will bode well for Rome Odunze. He's going to be very, very difficult to acquire. So I try not to put players on these types of lists that are going to cost anything crazy or going to be really difficult to acquire. But if he's on a team that, it's middle of the pack, you're probably not going to be able to get him on a rebuilder. But again, this is where you can work out a potential deal with guys that are injured. Maybe there's something that you can make work with another young guy. But Rome Odunze, to me, is somebody that is going to be a top 20 wide receiver for the foreseeable future. And if there is any way to acquire him in your league, I would go ahead and try to make that move. He's going to cost you, at a minimum, you're probably looking at least a first and a second. You're probably going to have to toss in a player as well, because I do think that he has solidified himself as a top 20 dynasty receiver, and is somebody that's not going to come cheap, but should give you very good production for that price. Next up is the other younger player on this list, and that is New York Giants wide receiver Wan'Dale Robinson. He's only 24, which seems crazy because it feels like he's been around forever, but he still is only 24, and he is the number one target right now for Jackson Dart and the New York Giants with Malik Neighbors injured. So this is a player that you can plug into your lineup. He's not going to cost a first-round pick. I think you could get him for a second. I think you could get him in a player trade. It's somebody that he's not an impossible guy to go out and trade for. And I think people recognize the situation as, hey, he's got some good value this year, and next year he's probably going to just revert back to being the flex play, bye-week fill-in type of guy that he is. But that still has some amount of value to it. And if you're a contending team, you need somebody healthy that can get on the field now and get targets. Wan'Dale Robinson is somebody that can do that. He always gets tons of targets, and whenever he scores, he ends up with huge weeks. So PPR type of player, if you play in a standard or half-point league, you're probably not as interested in somebody like Wan'Dale Robinson. But if you're in a full PPR league, Wan'Dale Robinson is a player I think to go and check in on. And the final receiver I wanted to bring up is LA Rams wideout Davante Adams, 32 years old. And this is based a lot on the injury to Puka Nacua. So Puka has been, basically the number one player in fantasy. He's been the number one wide receiver, and then he got hurt. So we don't know how much time Puka will end up missing. Could be 1 week, it could be 2, it could be a month. We just don't know. From what we have been told, it seems like it's not a season ender. It's not something that's going to put him out for multiple months. But I think it is reasonable to worry about at least the next few weeks. And we've seen Matthew Stafford feed Puka. We've seen him target one receiver, just a immense amount in terms of targets. I mean, over the years, it's been Calvin Johnson. We've seen Cooper Kupp, now Puka, and Davante Adams can certainly fill that role. He's been that dude for his career, and he's already been pretty good this season. He's been a guy that you can plug in every single week and feel good about. And so now the targets are going to go up. He is going to be counted on for more, and he can deliver. So again, this is not a player that's going to cost you a first-round pick. He is far too old to be moving that kind of draft capital. I think a late second is enough to get Davante Adams if he is on a rebuilder, because at that point you're just trying to get out. Rebuilding teams should not be holding on to guys like Davante Adams. So if you do not feel that you have a championship window, and you're just not looking like a playoff team, it's time to move on from guys like this. And so I think this is a guy that a deal can be done, whether it's a second and you have to add something later, or a player, or whatever the situation may be. The rest is gravy, really. It's the second round pick, I think, is plenty to get this deal done. And he's going to give you some good production, and it can be a win-win for both sides. Rebuilding team gets a solid asset, and the veteran, heads over to a contender where, it can help them try to win a championship. So Davante Adams, the fourth receiver on this list. All right, so let's talk about a few tight ends. This is a player that I think is one of the more easy positions to make trade deadline acquisitions, or just pick up guys in season as a contender from rebuilders, because there's always a lot of pretty solid veterans. So Dallas Goedert, for example, has been great this year. He's been a top 5 tight end. He's been awesome, but he's 30 years old. So rebuilding teams probably going to be willing to move on for a second round pick. And I think that's a deal that will absolutely get done. In fact, I have an offer for for me to receive Goddard and give up a second-round pick in a league where I have a kind of a mediocre team. I'm like one of those, like the number 6 team in the league. And so probably not a move for that team to make. But if I was, the number 2 team in the league, or I had a huge hole at tight end, that could be a deal that I think would make a lot of sense. I know he sent that offer in that particular league to a whole bunch of teams, and it's certainly something that can happen. Travis Kelce, another one of those guys, veteran, don't know how many more years there is, but he's off to a good start. But Rashee Rice is coming back, and that could affect things. But Travis Kelce is a guy that can be acquired. Hunter Henry is in his 30s for the Patriots. He's a solid, steady producer. Dalton Schultz, another one of those names. So there's all kinds of veteran guys at tight end. So I'm not going to talk too much about the veterans. I will start with one, though, that does make my list of 3 that I think would be especially good targets for contending teams, and that's going to be George Kittle. So he's 32 years old, and I feel like my opinion on George Kittle has really been like a roller coaster over the past several seasons, because last year and the year before, it was one of those things where he had all these injuries and was starting to get up into his 30s, and so I was pretty much out on George Kittle. So unfortunately for me, I do not have many. In fact, I don't know that I have any shares of George Kittle on my various dynasty teams. I have quite a few, more than 10, somewhere in the double digits there. And I don't think I have George Kittle in any of them, which is very sad for my contending teams, because he's going to be awesome when he comes back from injury. I think a lot of people have kind of put him out of sight, out of mind, but he's still a very, very productive player. He's going to be very much needed to that 49ers team when he returns. They've been so banged up pretty much everywhere on offense, quarterback, wide receiver, you name it. And so he's going to resume kind of the top spot in that pecking order, and he's going to be fed, and he's going to be a great, great player to have, especially in tight end premium leagues. So George Kittle, the first name on this list. Now, the other 2 are young guys. So first is going to be Seattle Seahawks tight end A.J. Barner. He's 23 years old, and he has a pretty full grasp on the starting job in Seattle over Elijah Arroyo, who is the second-round pick, the rookie. And this is Barner's job. Barner is the dude for fantasy. I've been on him all off season. I've been talking about him a lot as kind of a sleeper, low-level player that I like a lot. I kind of feel like A.J. Barner, I feel similar about him to how I felt about Tucker Kraft before he got big. So he fits that mold for me. He's kind of my young, up-and-coming, under-the-radar guy that I think is a very worthwhile player to go after in Dynasty, regardless of your situation, whether you're a rebuilder or a contender. And, he had a huge week a couple games ago. He had a nice long catch this past week. There's going to be some streakiness here. Partially due to, the way that Seattle's offense is structured, where they're just not, I wouldn't call them a very high-powered offense. And Jackson Smith and Jigba is going to really get the bulk of the passing work. But Barner is going to be productive. He's going to have a lot of weeks where you can feel good about him being in your lineup. And he's young enough that I think he's going to just keep getting better. And so he's somebody that I would go out and see what you can make happen. Because, again, I don't think it's going to cost a ton. Now, given that he's young and he's had some nice weeks, not going to cost as little as he might have, a month and a half ago. You're probably not getting him for just that 3rd-round pick. It's probably going to take a late second at this point. I think a 2nd-round pick is pretty fair, would make a lot of sense, and he kind of fits that mold. And if he can just hold on to that job, we could be in for a multi-year starter, and would be a nice little bonus for whoever ended up picking him up or stashing him from after he was drafted as a rookie. Now, the next player on this list is currently a rookie, another late-round guy that I think got overlooked by a lot of the fantasy community, except for some of those, more diehard dynasty folks who you probably fit into if you're listening to this podcast. But Oronde Gadsden, 22 years old from the LA Chargers, and he has benefited from additional opportunities with Will Dissly being injured. Tyler Conklin has not really latched onto that job. This has gradually turned into Oronde Gadsden's starting job. I think he finally broke 70 or 75% of snaps last week. He's had a couple nice games. He's getting more and more involved. And the Chargers are using him in a way that is pretty focused on just the receiving work. He's not somebody that is going to be in there blocking all the time. He's not that type of guy. He used to be a wide receiver in college before shifting over to tight end at Syracuse in the last year. And so he's got the hands and the receiving ability to essentially play that like big slot type of role that we've seen a lot of success out of for various tight ends around the league. So Gadsden to me is a very sneaky, underrated player that I think is starting to come into his own. And I think it depends on your league. You just have to know whether the guys that you're playing with are, the more diehard guys that really are dialed into everything, and in which case it's probably going to cost you a second to go get him. I've had that offer. I've had that actually discussed in my inbox on Sleeper, and I think I'm going to turn it down, which makes me feel crazy. Because if you had told me 2 months ago that I could get a second-round pick for a fifth-round rookie tight end that, there was no guarantee he'd even play, I would have said, of course you have to take that deal. You'd be crazy. But, it's a league. I have Justin Herbert. He's been a productive player. I'm more of a, rebuilding or middle-of-the-pack team, and I like the potential that's there. And so this is where, again, if you're contending or rebuilding, he's young enough, obviously as a rookie. Doesn't really matter your team situation. You can go get him. I think in a lot of situations, a second will be enough. I think it's just because he's somebody that I have liked from the draft. He would fall into a similar bucket, I would say, to the A.J. Barner or the Tucker Kraft. It's kind of, I like identifying those under-the-radar tight ends, and Gadsden, I think, fits that mold, and so I want to see it through. I have him on a number of teams, and he's somebody that catching footballs from Justin Herbert, that's a valuable spot to be for fantasy football. So Oronde Gadsden is the last tight end on this list. All right, so there you have it. There are some names here. I believe there were 12 different players that we talked about here. I'll run through the quick list. Dak Prescott, Baker Mayfield, Breece Hall, Josh Jacobs, Saquon Barkley, Cortland Sutton, Rome Odunze, Wan'Dale Robinson, Devontae Adams, A.J. Barner, Oronde Gadsden, and George Kittle. So thank you very much for tuning in. I am hoping that we will be back next week for another episode. Of course, throughout the season, there are weeks here and there where things get crazy during the week. I just am unable to record every single week. But for the most part, I try to keep it consistent and get something out there. But I'll try to post on social media, on the Twitter account, if there are any scheduled changes. But I'm expecting an episode next week. And it is a great time of year to make some trades. After week 6 is where I really think you start to see some separation between the contenders and the pretenders. And, the teams are starting to figure out if they need to go rebuild mode or push for a contending spot. So it's a really fun time of the year for trades. I think starting right around, week 5 and then, going through the next, 5 weeks or so are really some of the key moments in the Dynasty trade landscape. So don't be afraid to go out there, make some moves, see where your team's at, and be honest with yourself about where your team is and its ability to contend, and you can go out there and get some deals done. So thank you all very much for tuning in to this week's show. My name is Andrew Valancourt, and you have been listening to the Dynasty War Room podcast.